There is a narrative in the Old Testament that, to be completely honest with you, I consider the most impactful in the entire Bible. Perhaps it is inappropriate for a younger audience. So before we proceed with this video, it is essential to highlight that the content is not suitable for all ages and may trigger traumatic memories. The story is recorded in chapters 19 to 21 of the book of Judges. Although many are familiar with chapter 19, few delve into the entirety of the narrative. However, I believe that there are fundamental lessons we can learn even from such a disturbing story. First, I will share the events dramatically, and then I will analyze the lessons it teaches us. Join me in the book of Judges, chapter 19. At that time, when there was no king in Israel, a Levite was living in the hill country of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. It is important to understand that this Levite lived in the north of Israel, while his concubine or wife resided in the south, in Bethlehem. The story continues by telling that the woman was unfaithful to the Levite, abandoning him and returning to her father's house in Bethlehem, where she remained for 4 months. Thus, the Levite decided to go after her, traveling from the mountains of Ephraim to Bethlehem to reconcile and restore the relationship. When he arrived in Bethlehem, the woman's father received him with generous hospitality for several days. The Levite tried to leave with his wife, but her father insisted that they stay one more night. This repeated until the man finally decided to return. It is from this point that the tragedy begins to unfold. During the return trip north towards Ephraim, they approached Jebus at nightfall. The servant suggested they spend the night in that Jebusite city, but the Levite refused, stating that he would not stay in a foreign city. They then decided to continue to Gibeah. Upon arriving in Gibeah at night, no one offered them lodging. In Israelite culture, hospitality was an essential value. Finally, an elderly man found them in the square and asked why they were still without shelter. After hearing their situation, he offered his house for them to spend the night. The Levite thanked him and assured him that they only needed a place to rest and something to feed their animals. However, the story takes a dark turn. During the night, wicked men of the city surrounded the house, demanding that the elderly man hand over his guest so that they could abuse him. The elderly man tried to convince him to desist by offering his virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine instead, and not commit such an atrocity against the man. What happens next is unimaginable. In verse 25, we read that, faced with the insistence, the Levite handed over his concubine. The men violated and mistreated her throughout the night. At dawn, they abandoned her. Now you understand why I highlighted that this video may be unsuitable for minors and may trigger painful memories. Imagine the suffering of this woman, dishonored repeatedly. Finally, she managed to return exhausted to the door of the house where her lord was staying, but collapsed there without the strength to enter. At dawn, the Levite opened the doors to continue his journey and found his concubine lying by the entrance with her hands reaching the threshold. When he ordered her to get up, there was no response, for the woman had died. The account continues, and in a shocking act, the Levite took her body home. There he took a knife, divided the body into 12 parts, and sent each part to different regions of Israel. Everyone who saw it was perplexed, saying that nothing so horrible had ever happened since the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. It is important to reflect on this account. After the tragic event, the Levite not only took his concubine home and mutilated her, but also attached a letter to each part of the body, sending the pieces to the 12 tribes of Israel. In each letter, he detailed the heinous act that the members of the tribe of Benjamin had committed. When the other tribe received and read about the woman's fate, they were horrified. stating that something so terrible had never occurred in their history. This story continues in chapters 20 and 21 of the book of Judges, and there is still much to explore from this point. Let's begin to extract some lessons. The first is that when there's a lack of responsibility in our lives, there is a strong tendency to deviate. Judges 19 verse 1 highlights this by mentioning that in those days, there was no king in Israel. When we do not feel the need to be accountable or fear taking responsibility for our decisions and actions, we tend to follow destructive paths. The absence of responsibility leads us to believe that we can act in isolation without needing to answer to anyone. This was the context in Israel at that time. There was no king, and although there were laws, they were not respected or enforced. The result was that people took actions they probably never imagined. This lack of responsibility contributed to a series of unexpected and disastrous events. The second lesson I want to highlight is the importance of treating every human being as a bearer of God's image. In the narrative, the elderly man demonstrates a misguided view by stating that it would be wrong to harm a man, but that they could do what they wanted with his daughter and the Levite's concubine. This mindset reflects a belief that the man's life and dignity were more valuable than that of his own daughter and the concubine. It is essential that we recognize the image of God in each person, attributing to them an inherent value. This leads us to reflect on our attitudes, especially when consuming inappropriate content online, and to ensure that we treat others with respect and dignity. The third reflection I want to emphasize in this video is that as we distance ourselves from God, we become more susceptible to actions we never imagined committing. When analyzing the book of Judges as a whole, we observe a nation that progressively distanced itself from God. Chapters 19 to 21 represent the apex of this estrangement, showing how far the nation had deviated. This narrative serves as a warning to all of us. If we do not maintain a close connection with God, we can end up straying and doing things that previously seemed unthinkable to us. Being close to God is essential to avoid falling into temptations and sins that, at another time, we would not even consider. Unfortunately, the story becomes even more complicated in chapter 20, when a civil war breaks out between the 11 tribes of Israel and the tribe of Benjamin due to the heinous act committed by the latter against one of their own Israelite brothers. I recommend reading chapters 20 and 21 in detail, but to summarize, a colossal battle results in the loss of thousands of lives on both sides. At the end of the war, only 600 men from the tribe of Benjamin remain. In chapter 21, the other 11 tribes begin to feel compassion for the tribe of Benjamin, concerned about their possible extinction. The 600 surviving men have no women of their own tribe to marry and perpetuate their people. This compassion, however, generates a new problem as they fear the disappearance of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. This situation teaches us a fourth lesson. Every wrong decision we make brings inevitable consequences. Despite the initial grave error of the Benjamites, the decision of the other tribes to fight and kill was a choice that now brings undesirable consequences. The Benjamites also face the repercussions of their destructive actions. Each decision, whether good or bad, brings consequences that shape our future. We are often forced to face the repercussions of our past choices. This narrative highlights that although we can choose our actions, we cannot choose the consequences that accompany them. The story continues to show how the Israelites made another bad decision by allowing the Benjamites to abduct women during a festival, justifying this action to avoid breaking a previous oath in which they promised not to give their daughters to the men of Benjamin. This event illustrates how one wrong decision often leads to another, creating a chain of unexpected and often disastrous consequences. Thus, during the festival, 200 men of Benjamin abduct women who were dancing, taking them as wives. I recognize that this is a shocking story, and I tried to summarize it briefly. However, the main point is that one bad decision often triggers another, and a series of wrong choices can negatively impact many lives. When analyzing this story, it is evident how many people were harmed by a single misguided decision. Some men of Benjamin faced deserved consequences, but most of the Benjamite people who had not directly participated in the initial transgression perished in the battle. Additionally, the people of Jabesh Gilead also suffered losses, and their women were torn from their lands, becoming victims of these circumstances. Here's the fifth and final lesson I want to highlight. God grants us grace even in the midst of our most destructive decisions. The book of Judges concludes by recounting that the Benjamites, despite their actions, managed to rebuild their cities, inhabit them, and received a new chance. Each Israelite returned to their tribe and family, reclaiming their inheritance. The last verse of the book highlights a prominent characteristic of that time. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. This phrase summarizes the entire book of Judges, highlighting the lack of effective leadership and the consequences of each person following their own path. Thus, even in the face of destructive decisions, God manifests His grace by allowing the tribe of Benjamin to rebuild. However, it is essential to understand that although grace exists, decisions continue to bring often unpredictable and uncontrollable consequences. If there is something I wish for you to take away from this video, it is that every choice we make brings consequences, some of which we cannot even foresee. That's it for now. And with this, we conclude another video. I hope today's lessons have touched your heart and helped you reflect on the consequences of our choices. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Your subscription is very important for us to continue growing together on this learning journey. God bless you, and see you in the next video.